For many years, my life was guided by a fear I rarely named. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was always present, shaping my choices quietly from the background. I was afraid of failing, afraid of falling behind, afraid of being seen as someone who was not good enough. I didn't describe it as fear at the time. I called it responsibility. I called it ambition. I told myself I was simply being disciplined. But looking back, I can see how deeply fear was woven into the way I lived. From an early age, I learned that success felt safe. Achievements brought approval, and approval brought a sense of relief. When I performed well, I felt accepted. When I didn't, I felt exposed. So I began to organize my life around avoiding that exposure. I chose paths that looked reliable. I pursued goals that could be measured. I learned how to work hard and push myself, even when I was already tired. I learned how to look confident, even when I felt uncertain. From the outside, my life looked productive and focused. I was moving forward. I was doing what was expected of me, but inside, the pressure never really stopped. Every achievement quietly raised the expectation for the next one. Every success came with the silent question of whether I could repeat it. I didn't allow myself to slow down. Slowing down felt dangerous, as if it might give failure time to catch up with me. Rest felt undeserved. Pauses felt like weakness. I believed that staying busy was the only way to stay ahead. Over time, this way of living became normal. I stopped questioning it. I told myself this was simply what adulthood required, that everyone carried pressure. That stress was the price of progress. I measured my days by what I completed, not by how I felt. If I was exhausted, I ignored it. If I felt empty, I pushed forward anyway. I believed meaning would come later, after enough effort, after enough proof that I was capable. During those years, English was very far away, not because it was impossible, but because it felt unnecessary. English belonged to uncertainty, to exploration, to starting again as a beginner. And I didn't want to be a beginner. I wanted to be competent. I wanted to stay in control. My life already demanded enough from me. I didn't want another area where I might fail publicly. So English stayed in the background. I knew it existed. I knew it could be useful. But I told myself I would deal with it later, when things felt more stable, when I felt more confident. For now, I focused on what I was already good at. I stayed inside familiar systems, familiar language, familiar expectations. That felt safer. As the years passed, the pressure didn't disappear. It grew quieter, but heavier. I became very good at meeting expectations, but less good at listening to myself. I reacted strongly to mistakes, even small ones. I compared myself to others more than I admitted. I felt uncomfortable when things were uncertain. I needed clear outcomes, clear evaluations, and clear proof that I was doing well. There were moments when I noticed how tense I had become. Usually late at night, when the day was finally quiet, I would feel a tightness in my chest, a sense that I was constantly preparing for something, even when nothing was happening. But I didn't stay with that feeling. I reminded myself of what I had achieved. I planned the next step. Planning became another way to avoid stillness. I didn't feel unhappy, but I didn't feel calm either. My life was full, but narrow. I was moving fast, but only in one direction. Everything was about improvement, progress, and avoiding mistakes. I rarely asked myself what I actually wanted beyond succeeding. That question felt risky. Wanting something unclear meant stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty felt like failure waiting to happen. English remained distant because it represented exactly what I was avoiding. It meant speaking imperfectly, making mistakes in public, not knowing what to say. It meant beginning without guarantees, and guarantees were what made me feel safe. So I postponed it again and again, telling myself the time wasn't right. I believed that once I reached a certain level, once I felt secure enough, I would finally relax. I would explore. I would learn new things. I would live more freely. But that level kept moving, and the finish line never stayed still. The fear of falling short quietly followed me everywhere. At that stage of my life, I didn't see this as a problem. I saw it. I saw it as maturity. I believed pressure was useful, even necessary. I didn't yet understand that living in constant fear of failure slowly changes the way you see yourself. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending just trying not to fail. I didn't see how tightly my identity was tied to performance. I only knew that stopping felt impossible and slowing down felt dangerous. So I kept going, carrying pressure quietly, believing that one day it would all make sense. I didn't know yet that this way of living would lead me to a moment of stillness, a moment where success would no longer protect me from myself, a moment that would force me to look at fear not as a motivator, but as a weight I had been carrying for far too long. That moment had not arrived yet, but it was closer than I realized. After years of living under pressure, I didn't expect anything to break. I believed I had learned how to manage it. I knew how to keep going. I knew how to push past discomfort. So when the moment finally arrived, it didn't look like a collapse. It didn't announce itself. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary experience that simply refused to pass. At first, it felt like exhaustion, not the kind that sleep could fix, but a deeper tiredness that stayed even after rest. I noticed that achievements no longer brought relief. Finishing tasks didn't make me lighter. Success felt neutral, almost empty. I completed things and immediately moved on, without the satisfaction I once depended on. Something had shifted, though I didn't yet understand what it was. I began to notice how sensitive I had become to small failures. A minor mistake felt heavier than it should have. A delayed result felt personal. I reacted more strongly, even though I told myself I was experienced enough to handle these things. The fear I had relied on as motivation was no longer pushing me forward. It was tightening around me. There were moments when I caught myself staring at nothing, my mind unusually quiet, not peaceful, just blank. The constant planning, the constant anticipation of the next step began to feel exhausting instead of reassuring. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped measuring myself for a moment. The thought made me uneasy. I remember a specific period when everything slowed down on the outside. Work continued. Life continued. But my internal pace changed. I felt disconnected from the urgency that had once driven me. Tasks felt heavier. Decisions felt harder. I wasn't failing, but I wasn't advancing either. I was suspended in a strange in-between state. That was when fear began to change its shape. It was no longer about failing publicly. It was about continuing this way indefinitely. I realized I was afraid not of falling behind, but of staying exactly where I was, carrying the same pressure year after year. The idea that this might be my permanent way of living unsettled me. I didn't talk about this with anyone. From the outside, nothing was wrong. I was still functioning. I was still responsible. I was still meeting expectations. There was no language for what I was feeling. It didn't sound serious enough to explain, and it didn't feel dramatic enough to justify concern. So I kept it to myself. English during this phase began to appear in my thoughts again, though I didn't act on it, not as a skill to learn, but as a symbol. It represented another version of myself, one who might be clumsy, uncertain, and slow. That version frightened me, but also intrigued me. There was something honest about starting from zero, something that felt different from the constant pressure to perform. I noticed how carefully I avoided situations where I might not be competent. I chose familiarity whenever possible. I stayed within boundaries that guaranteed control, and for the first time, I saw how small my world had become because of that. Safe, yes, but limited. The pressure I had carried for so long began to feel less like discipline and more like a weight. It pressed down quietly, not enough to stop me, but enough to drain me. I realized I was no longer moving forward out of curiosity or desire. I was moving out of habit, and habit alone wasn't enough to sustain me. There were nights when I lay awake, not anxious, just aware. Aware that something wasn't aligned. Aware that my life was built entirely around avoiding failure, not around moving toward anything meaningful. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity, and clarity can be unsettling. I began to understand that fear had been useful only up to a point. Beyond that point, it stopped protecting me and started limiting me. It narrowed my choices. It shaped my identity. It kept me busy, but it kept me distant from myself. I haven't made any decisions yet. I didn't quit anything. I didn't start anything new. I simply noticed, and noticing was enough to change how everything felt. The pressure was still there, but it was no longer invisible. I could see it now, sitting at the center of my life, influencing every choice I made. I realized that as long as fear was in control, nothing truly new could enter my life. Growth would remain limited to what felt safe. Learning would be restricted to what confirmed my competence. English remained distant because it represented exposure, and exposure felt unacceptable. That understanding stayed with me. It didn't push me forward yet, but it prepared me. It softened the certainty I once had about who I was and how I needed to live. For the first time, I allowed the possibility that my way of living, though successful on the surface, might not be sustainable. I didn't yet know what I would do with that awareness. I only knew that something had cracked, not dramatically, but enough to let a new question form. What would happen if I stopped letting fear decide everything? That question did not demand an immediate answer. It simply stayed with me, quietly, waiting, and without realizing it, I was already closer to the moment that would force me to respond. The question stayed with me longer than I expected. I didn't try to answer it. I didn't even repeat it often. But it quietly changed the way I moved through my days. I became more attentive, not to outcomes, but to my own reactions. I began to notice how quickly fear appeared, even in small situations. How easily it pushed me toward safe choices. How naturally I avoided uncertainty. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no single moment when I decided to change my life. Instead, there were many small moments where I hesitated. Moments where I paused before responding, before planning, before pushing myself forward out of habit. Those pauses were unfamiliar. They felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. I had lived for so long believing that constant movement was necessary. During those pauses, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: space. Not relief, not freedom, just space. Space where nothing was being demanded of me. Space where I didn't need to perform. At first, that space felt empty, and emptiness made me uneasy. I was used to pressure. Pressure gave my days structure. Without it, I felt slightly unanchored. I began to see how much of my identity was built around achievement. How often I described myself through what I did, what I accomplished, and what I could handle. Without those markers, I wasn't sure how to define myself. That realization was unsettling, but also honest. It showed me how narrowly I had been living. Around this time, English returned, not forcefully, but persistently. I noticed it in small ways. A video I watched late at night, a voice telling a slow story, a sentence I didn't fully understand but felt drawn to. For the first time, English didn't feel like a tool for success. It felt like an invitation to slow down. Listening to English forced me to pause. I couldn't rush through meaning. I had to wait. I had to accept not understanding everything. That experience mirrored what was happening inside me. I was learning to stay with uncertainty instead, and strangely, that felt calming. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a goal. It was something private, something quiet. I listened without pressure. I allowed myself to be a beginner without judging it. That alone felt like a small act of courage. I noticed how different it felt to learn without the need to prove anything. There were no deadlines, no evaluations, no expectations, just curiosity. That was unfamiliar territory for me. I realized how rarely I did things simply because they felt meaningful, without attaching them to improvement or results. This shift began to affect other areas of my life. I stopped rushing conversations. I listened more carefully. I didn't always try to solve things immediately. I noticed how often I had used action to avoid reflection. Now, allow reflection to exist before action. The fear of failure didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip. It no longer dictated every decision. I began to see fear not as an enemy to fight, but as a signal, a sign that I was standing near something unfamiliar, something that mattered. I realized that growth did not always require force. Sometimes it required staying still long enough to understand what was happening. I had spent years pushing forward without checking whether the direction made sense. Now, for the first time, I was willing to question that direction. There were days when I felt unsure, even lost. I didn't rush to label those feelings as problems. I allowed them to exist. That alone was new. I had always believed uncertainty was something to eliminate as quickly as possible. Now, I was learning that uncertainty could also be informative. English remained part of this learning, not as a challenge, but as a companion. It reminded me that progress could be slow and still be real, that understanding didn't come as a breakthrough. It settled gradually, like something finally finding its place. I didn't yet feel transformed. I didn't feel confident in a new way. What I felt was openness, a sense that my life was no longer completely closed off by fear. There was room now for exploration. Even if I didn't know where it would lead, I began to understand that I didn't need to defeat fear to move forward. I only needed to stop letting it lead. That distinction changed everything. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't chasing certainty. I was learning how to stay present with questions that didn't have immediate answers. And that presence, though uncomfortable at times, felt honest. I didn't know it yet, but this quiet shift was preparing me for something deeper, something that would not arrive as success or failure, but as clarity, the kind of clarity that comes not from achieving more, but from understanding why you move at all. And that clarity was closer than I thought. The clarity did not arrive as an answer. It did not tell me what to do next or where to go. It arrived as a change in how I related to myself. I began to see that fear had never been the real problem. Fear was only the surface. What truly shaped my life was how much I tried to control it. For years, I believed control was safety. If I planned carefully enough, if I prepared enough, if I avoided mistakes, then life would remain manageable. But that belief came with a cost. It kept my world small. It kept my choices predictable. And it kept me from experiencing parts of myself that could only appear in uncertainty. I started to understand that failure was not something that happened to me. It was something I had been avoiding so intensely that I never allowed myself to grow beyond what felt secure. The pressure I carried was not proof of strength. It was proof of fear disguised as discipline. That realization did not make me angry with myself. It softened me. I could see why I had lived the way I did. I had been trying to protect myself, and for a long time, that protection had worked. It helped me survive. It helped me achieve. But survival is not the same as living. I didn't suddenly become fearless. I didn't stop caring about results. What changed was my relationship with uncertainty. I no longer treated it as a threat. I began to see it as a space where something new could happen, a space where I didn't need to know everything in advance. English became part of that space, not as a challenge to conquer, but as a place to practice staying with imperfection, staying with hesitation, staying with not knowing the right words. When I spoke English, I learned that meaning did not disappear just because the expressions was imperfect. People still listened. Conversations still moved forward. Connection still happened. That lesson stayed with me. It reminded me that life does not require flawless execution. It requires participation, showing up, trying, staying present, even when you feel unsure. I stopped waiting to feel confident before beginning. I began even when confidence was missing. This shift changed how I approached everything. Conversations became less tense. Decisions became less heavy. I allowed myself to move forward without guarantees. I allowed myself to change my mind. I allowed myself to learn slowly. I realized that fear loses its power when you stop treating it as a warning and start treating it as information. Fear simply shows you where you care, where something matters. It doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be understood. I didn't replace my old life with a new one. I adjusted how I lived inside it. I became less rigid, less defensive, more curious. I learned that growth does not come from pushing harder. It comes from listening more closely. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself in these moments, I want to say this gently. There is nothing wrong with you for being afraid. Fear is not a sign that you are weak. It is a sign that you are human. What matters is not whether fear appears, but who gets to decide when it does. You don't need to wait until fear disappears to begin. You don't need to be certain to move forward. You only need to be willing to stay present when things feel unclear. English, like life, does not reward perfection. It rewards patience. It rewards attention. It rewards the courage to continue, even when you feel unsure. Every imperfect sentence spoken is proof that you chose participation over avoidance. I no longer live to avoid failure. I live to remain honest with myself. I choose curiosity over control, presence over pressure, growth over safety. I still feel fear sometimes. I still hesitate, but I don't turn away from those moments anymore. I stay with them long enough to understand what they are asking of me, and what they ask is simple. Not to be fearless, but to be present. That is how my relationship with fear changed. That is how my relationship with learning changed. That is how my relationship with myself changed. Quietly, gradually, without announcement, and that change, though subtle, has been enough to keep going, enough to keep learning, enough to finally feel like I am living, not just succeeding. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing, and if you take one thing with you, let it be this: you don't need to conquer fear to move forward. You only need to stop letting it decide for you. That is where real growth begins.